Well, we'd like to welcome everyone to another Sunday class from the Brigham Young University Library Family History Center. And today we're going to be talking about geography for the genealogist. Now, there's a lot of topics that come along when you decide you want to be involved in doing family history. It's history, first of all, that's the most important thing you need to remember. It's always that we're talking about history, and that history comes from documents and any records that would made of what happened in the past. But the very, very essential part of learning about genealogy is understanding the importance of the locations, the geographical locations of things. And many of the records that are valuable that you might not usually run into unless you start doing research beyond the normal birth, marriage, and death, BMD records, and census records. Usually I can go through the family trees and see how much research has been done on a family if only records they have are a few vital records and maybe some census records. So there's a lot to move beyond that, but a lot of what happens when we do move beyond that is that we have to have some knowledge about geography and how the world is put together. So, repeating, genealogy is history, and genealogists use historical records to discover the stories of their ancestors and relatives. So it's this is the key to the understanding of how we do the work, and how we work is based on the fact that we need to discover some more the historical records. So when we look at those historical records, the genealogically valuable records, that would mean records that have direct information about the people we're looking for. They record events in your ancestors' and relatives' lives and are organized and found geographically by the location of the events. Okay, so here's the deal. The deal is that something happens, a person is born, and the important thing to understand is when the person is born, gets married, dies, whatever it is, it happens in a specific location on the face of the earth. Today, it would be a little bit hard to say that every time, because I suppose it's going to be pretty hard to get born remotely, but you could get married remotely, I suppose. I don't know where and if any jurisdictions would allow that, but there's things that can. And when you die and where you die is going to be a specific location. So as we go through life, the idea here is to start visualizing the events within your life and your ancestors' lives in terms of a series of things that happen at specific places. And so that's the associations we have. So we might look at for example, a trip we took, and in each case, we remember the places we visited, and we may have taken a bunch of pictures or even movies or whatever of our trip. And that will help us to understand where we were when certain events happened. Well, that's kind of the whole process here with genealogy is we have to do it sort of backwards because we're going into the past with historical records. So in order to get back into the past, we have to know where the events occurred. And that's kind of, I'm going to go through that a few times and explain it in different ways so you'll understand what I'm saying about that. And it turns out that one of the main tasks of a genealogical researcher is to locate genealogically valuable records around the world. Over the years, I've probably spent the bulk of the time I've done that you would call my genealogical research and simply trying to find the records originally. We seem to think that they're all going to magically appear today because they're digitized and we can instantly find it. And eventually, there's going to be the tools. One is I can mention is called full text searches, which has been around for quite a while. But on the other hand, it hasn't been applied to handwritten documents because handwriting recognition was not available. Now we've combined handwriting recognition with the ability to transcribe handwritten documents and then apply a full text search, which means they're going to search every single word. And that way, you can search every word in every document. And when we get to that point, which we are very rapidly getting to with most of the websites, including Family Search, and that is that we'll be able to do searches on specific things like we do on Google, and we'll look for names and dates and places and things within the document set. But that's going to take some time. And just like everything in genealogy, there's a lag time between the technology and the implementation and the availability down to the user level. And so what we're looking for here is ways to expedite that whole process. But meanwhile, in order to make some sense out of all the things that are happening with when you're looking for genealogy, you have to remember that there are ways to find the records, and they're all essentially keyed or stored, contained, referenced geographically by location. So if you want records of your ancestor who lived in New York State, you have to go to New York State records. It sounds like, yeah, I mean, why wouldn't you think that? Well, the answer is that this is not obvious. It doesn't occur to people that this is the case, that this is how we're going to be able to find the records until someone either tells them or it finally dawns on them that they're having to look geographically to find anything that they're interested in. So even though many genealogically valuable records have been digitized and are available online, there's many records left to be digitized and many more which will probably never be digitized. And they may be very valuable, and they may be the actual records that you're looking for. So we're going to spend some time understanding the relationship between the location of the events and where the records ultimately end up being available or not available, or maybe where they are or where they aren't. And this is kind of an admonition here. You should start your genealogical research in the places where the events occurred in your own life and in the lives of your ancestors and relatives. There needs to be, in a sense, an unbroken path, unbroken road, in this case, highway, of events that begin with yourself and you're in your birth and whatever position you have or are in your life right now. And then that series of events, of course, interfaces with your parents and your siblings and with your relatives in general. And then you move back in time and it takes in the next generation and the next generation. And the key here is that there's this always a location link, always a geographic link between the events as they go back in the past. The main issue is the first rule of genealogy, which is when the baby is born, the mother is there. And that is the issue. And when we start thinking in terms of having not just a temporal connection, meaning going back in time with your ancestors, but having a geographic, a locational connection between everybody. So it's so easy to get off the track because there's people with the same names and same family names and everything. And then you can find yourself kind of floating off into space where you've got people from different parts of the country with the same name in the same family, and they're not necessarily actually related. And that happens quite frequently because the names are seductive. You found your Frank Robinson that we're looking for, and now you know this is the one. And except your guy was born in Texas and this guy came from Minnesota. And you just cannot ignore the fact that there's you have to explain, in a sense, during your research, what you're doing is justifying moving back in time by connecting up the locations where the events occurred so that we actually have a valid parent-child relationship in each generation. And that means for every person. Every person you add into a family tree should have a record-based parent-child relationship in order to be put into a family. Now, there's lots of ways to do that, and there's a little bit of leeway in there also. So if you can't discover the place, if it's in the situation where you're working back in time and you lose the place, how does that happen? Well, it's simple here in the United States, because we're a nation of immigrants. And so people come to the United States from your ancestors. If your ancestors are European origin, then you're going to go back in time. You're eventually going to find a time when they came across the ocean and landed in the United States and America, or where this continent here. And if you're people, there's the obvious things that people always raise. They say, well, what about Native Americans? The Native Americans, well, the only difference between Native Americans in America and the rest of us is the time depth. They just go back further, and they may not be ever able to find out where their ancestors came from. Although there's news today, and there's a story going around of some more theories about the certain groups of the Amerindian or American Indian Native American populations here in the United States. But basically, what you're talking about each time you go back in time is reaching a point where you either know the next step geographically, or you don't. Too many times we'll find a record that says, census record, for example, that says that this person came from Germany or came from Switzerland or came from someplace in Europe. That doesn't help us at all, because now we just have a whole different world over there to try to guess where in that huge expanse of people and history that your ancestor or relative came from. So you're really stopped once you get to this point. There's no guessing, because guessing doesn't fill in the blanks. And so when you're out of these records, you're just out of records. I know it's frustrating, and I've heard that I've spent many years of my life doing research trying to push the places that my ancestors came from back one more step, and still have not been able to do it in many cases. So, what do we need to know? Well, one of the other admonitions that I would make that I think are extremely important is always learn about the places first. And what do I mean by that? Well, if I say that my ancestors, some of my ancestors came from a place called Beaver, Utah, I would suggest that one of the first things you would want to do is, if you were doing that research, is find out about Beaver. Who were there? When did they get there? Who settled it? Who were the first people there? When did my ancestors get there? Why is all this important? Well, because it determines where you're going to get the records. And I'll go through this in quite a bit more detail in just a few minutes. But basically, you need to start learning about the place. The first thing I do when I look at when somebody starts talking to me about their ancestors, I always stop and say, okay, so where did your ancestors come from? What was the location? And then they'll say, oh, they came from this town in Minnesota. And I'll go, that's great. So then I'll say, wait a minute, let's put it on the map. So then we put the place on the map on a Google Maps or another map program. And then I say, okay, now what, when did they first get there? And then we'll say, oh, well, then let's look up this place and see when the town was created. Let's find out when the first settlers reached to that point in time. Over in Europe, you have the same questions. When was the parish register began? When did the records begin to be kept, and where were they kept? And what about the place? Where is this place, and what's the chances of finding somebody? I mean, the obvious distinction is you can have a town that has a couple of hundred people, or you can have a mega city that has 10 million or 30 million people in it. And if you're looking at a city with 30 million people, as opposed to a little small town, then you have two vastly different issues about finding the records and what may or may not be available. That doesn't mean either one is easier than the other. It's sometimes harder to find somebody in a big city than it is to find them in a small town. But sometimes it seems impossible to find people in a small town. So the next step, once you begin to become aware about where these places were that you're looking at, So if I ran down, I mean, it is kind of a hypothetical question. So that if you were sitting here in front of me and I was helping you with your genealogy and I was looking at it and I went back on a pedigree chart online on Family Search or Ancestry or whatever, and I clicked back and I said, oh, these people came from Wilmington, Delaware. Do you know anything about Wilmington, Delaware? See, that's the question. In other words, that's my, I mean, initially, without even thinking, that is one of the very basic questions I'm going to be asking. And I'm not even surprised. I don't even, it doesn't even surprise me anymore to have the person say, no, I have no idea. Where's that? I don't know where it is. Well, okay, if you don't, this is kind of repetitious, but if you don't know the location, meaning if you don't understand where it is and how it is and what kind of a place it is, you're simply not going to be able to find the right records. And you're certainly not going to be able to distinguish between two people in that area with the same name. And so it's just going to be a different situation. So it's absolutely important. And you're wondering why this pile of pancakes is sitting in front of us. It's because we have a simple thing that we have to learn about, and it's the term is called jurisdictions. And it's when you talk about jurisdictions in court or legal ways or any kind of thing else like that, it doesn't mean the same thing as this does in genealogy. What jurisdictions mean in genealogy, who wrote the records, what is the place where the records were kept, and who developed those records. So first of all, if you look at it like pancakes, they're piled up on top of each other. You have local records. So there's records that are done clear down at the local basis, like records like the anything, school records for one, church records for another, records that are kept on a local basis. Then above that, you have the city records or municipality records. Those are records kept by the municipalities and cities. And each one of these layers is not duplicative. They're basically whole new sets of records at a different layer. So obviously, the city would take coverage on over quite a number of local records. And once you get into the cities, then you jump up to townships or counties or whatever other the next step up is in that particular jurisdiction that you're looking at in that area. Then you're going to have more cities in that area. Then the next step up is the state or province. They may be called something else, but it's the political subdivisions and the jurisdictional subdivisions of the towns and the countries of the world. And understanding that records are kept at each level and they have a tendency to stay at that level, or they can move sideways or up and down. It just depends on how that works. So then we go to the country level, the national level. And so let's give an example. Okay, a country level document in the United States would be federal income tax, census records, military records. State or province records might be birth records and death records. Township or county records might be land and property records in the county or marriage records in the county. City records might be might be tax records for the city. They might be any kind of records kept by a municipality, and there's lots. Local records, once again, would be like school and church and neighborhood kinds of things. So recognizing that all these levels exist, then you're going to be mentally working your way down through the records to get to the point where you've identified the exact location where your ancestor an event occurred. And then from there, you can continue to look for additional records as you move up and down through this stack of beautiful pancakes. Understand that each of these jurisdictions, each of these subdivisions of society and government keep their own records. I mean, if you go to your city, how many of you think about how many of you have a card for a specific store, for example, or a membership in or a library card from your local public library or whatever else there might be. How many of you belong to some kind of organization that has a club, a clubhouse, or a country club, or something of that nature? All of those things are, from the standpoint of genealogy, all of those are jurisdictions, and each one of those jurisdictions, meaning there are groups of people who are going to keep records about their group, and those are the records we need to learn to know how to identify. So, what are these kind of jurisdictions? Let's just kind of run through a lot: schools and counties, churches, regions, fraternal organizations, charitable organizations, districts, municipalities, townships, boards, territories, nations, states, provinces, everything. In other words, you're never going to really run out of all of the overlapping layers of possibility that there are going to be in any one part of the world. There are places where there may not be as many levels of jurisdiction, and other levels where there are many more layers of jurisdiction. Like the larger the cities, the more likely you are going to find a lot more jurisdiction. Now, if you could substitute it for bureaucracy, that's a nice word to use too. But we're not really talking about bureaucratic issues. We're talking here about record issues and where the records could be and might be stored. And for some reason, among genealogists, there's this kind of idea that, I don't know where that comes from, but they seem to think that nobody kept any records. And I get into agricultural co-ops, I get into schools, I get into churches, and just so many different things. And I say, well, there are records from these organizations. Your person worked for a railroad, there's railroad records. Your person worked for an insurance company, there are insurance company records. You got to make this connection that almost everything that goes on around you is creating records, and you can extend that back into the past and look for the same kinds of records in the past. So, just a point to get started on this process, and that is the general genealogical rule is to record the name of the places in your ancestors and relatives' lives as they existed at the time the events occurred. Okay, now there's some people, for some reason, they got this this concept in their head that records you needed to record the place where the records are instead of the place where the people lived. That sounds like I don't know why it doesn't sound like a very good idea to me, because I've been doing this for so long and worked in libraries forever. But just believe me, that doesn't work. There's just no way in the world that you're going to find the records if you say that the name of the place now, as opposed to the name of the place when it was first created. And the reason is very simple, is that you may be in a situation of naming a current location that did not exist when your ancestor lived. And so recording your place of birth, for example, in Germany, and from a person who was born in some parts of Europe, maybe was accurate in the 20th century, or even into some parts of the 19th century, very late parts in the 1800s. But no, basically that isn't very helpful. It's basically, it confuses the whole matter to try to modernize the place names. So obviously, we're stuck with doing some historical research as to place names. And fortunately, there are lots of records available, and they're fairly quickly established. One of the biggest tools, of course, is a program called Wikipedia that has practically every location on the face of the earth now on it's someplace on its. I only get maybe 1 out of 1,000 places that are not recorded on Wikipedia. So let's take one example of how this works. I'm going to just pick this place, San Isidro de Ciénaga del Toro. And this comes about because I do consultations with the Family Search Library in Salt Lake City. And they get people from all over the world signing up for the 20-minute consultations for free. And I'm one of the people that handles those consultations. So I schedule about 8 of them a week, and I usually end up with some of these every week. Very, 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 very commonly, when they fill out a form that tells what they would like me to look for, is they'll say, oh, well, my ancestor came from San Isidro de Ciénaga del Toro. That's it. That's what they tell me. Okay. So what's going to be my first question to this person? Yes, you're right. It's going to be, which country are we talking about? Where is this place? Well, okay. So then we'll begin a search. And so we'll see how this all works. So we're going to start asking a series of questions. Where is it? We need sort of a general idea. There's already been a note in the chat that says some places have the same names. Believe me, they do all over the world. There's so many common names. It's like Beaver, Utah, that I mentioned earlier. There's lots of places across the United States that have the name Beaver. Okay. Second, what are the jurisdictions? Well, what does that mean? It means that where would the records have been kept for that location when we're talking about the place that something happened? So we need to know where the records would have been kept. So if a person was married in this place, or he died in this place, or she was born in this place. So what would have been recorded at that time for that event, and where would that record have gone? Where's the layers of records above that person, which would have taken that? So then there's the basic question of what records could possibly exist for the location. This is very commonly problem is here in the United States, because people think in terms of what records are available today, and they will come to me and they'll say something like, well, I want looking for my great grandfather's marriage certificate. Well, okay. Where did he live? He lived in 1850 and got married in 1850. Where did he get married? Well, he got married in, oh, I don't know. I think it was a little town in southern Utah called Kanab. And so we go, well, that's interesting. So now what's the story right there? First of all, we go say, okay, we have a place. Let's go find out if Kanab existed in 1850. Let's assume that it did exist, which be pushing it. I don't think so, because that's probably before Kanab was settled. So then we go through the process of saying, when did they start keeping records? Who would be keeping records? Would they be kept by the city? No. And then you look on the Franny Search Research Wiki, and you find out that they didn't start keeping marriage records until 1880 or something like that in Utah, and there's no records. So this is kind of the process you go through, this thought process. And then when I'm looking at a place like San Isidro de Ciénaga del Toro, you've got to wonder, how long has that place been in existence? Where would this come from? And we want to know where the records are. Ultimately, we got to know where the records have been, where they're being kept, or where their work be kept. What can we expect to find? So you run Google's maps, and here we go. And there's the little town of San Isidro de Ciénaga del Toro. And we can then go turn on the satellite view and then the street view. And there's the satellite view, and that's the whole town. But there's a church right there. It says Iglesia de San Isidro. Oh, there's a church. Well, then maybe there's church records. Yeah. But now what are we stuck with? Well, we still don't really know where this place is. We've got it on a map, but now we need to go look at it. And by the way, in this particular case, I can't go down with a street view and look at this town because it is so far out in the middle of nowhere that there's no street view, which is a little bit unusual for even some places like this. So now we look it up, and now I mentioned Wikipedia, and this one happens to be, and this particular response on this place came up in, it looks like a Slovakian edition of Wikipedia. So I translated it into English, and so now we have the English version of it. Now we know a lot of things. First of all, we know, and then our person will usually confirm. I said, well, it looks to me like San Isidro's in Mexico. And they say, yes. And then I say, well, and it's probably in Nuevo León. And they say, yeah. And then I say, you didn't know that it's in the municipality of Galiana? And they go, no. So, yeah, but now we have enough information to actually have to make some progress on finding records about this place. So, one thing we perhaps would like to know before we got going and doing Mexican genealogy is how's Mexico's country laid out? What are the divisions, and where can we expect to look for the records? And these are the kinds of things that are in the Family Search Research Wiki. But it takes some time and you need to learn about it. So you go down and you learn about Mexico, and you'll find out that it has states, just like in the United States. They're called states, estados. And then you have municipalities, which roughly correspond to U.S. counties. They're larger than just a city. They include a lot of just surrounding country. So there you are. And now we have the information that we need right here. So now we can start looking for records. We have the country, Mexico, the state, Nuevo León, the municipality, Galeana, the town, San Isidro de Ciénaga del Toro, so we can find out if this place exists. And, as I mentioned a moment ago, there's a church. So knowing the time frame, and depending on the time frame, there could be either what are called civil registration records or church records in Mexico as a general class of records. And if we assume this went back a little bit further in time, we would want to look for the church records for very, very specific reasons, is that virtually the entire population were members of the Catholic Church, and they kept very good records about who was born, married, died, or was buried. We asked the question, where do we find the main record sets in Mexico? And I've mentioned already the Research Wiki a few times. And over on the right-hand side, the blue list of all the records are the church records and the civil registration records and other records. So then we can begin to categorize in the kinds of records that we may want to be able to find and what would be available. They have the Family Search Research Wiki has over 102,000 articles telling you every single place in the world and where the records might be kept, and what kind of records they are and what information you can expect to find. So if you're not using this to look up this information and learning about your people, then you're kind of flying blind. You're still out there in the desert getting lost. So now we realize, if we do some research here on the wiki, that civil registration and Catholic Church records are the way to go. And so we're going to be looking for them. So immediately we have to think, what is the Catholic parish for San Isidro de Ciénaga del Toro? The answer is a little more complicated, because now you need to learn the jurisdiction of the Catholic Church. In other words, you learn that the smallest geographic membership organization is called a parish, and a group of parishes are put into a diocese, and a group of dioceses, like sometimes, are put into an archdiocese. And so what you have are, well, we're back to our pancakes. We have layers of records. And so we're going to look primarily for Catholic parish registers, because those were the ones that recorded the births, burials, and the marriages, not necessarily in that order. So now I'm going to use one of the new tools, Microsoft Copilot, on the Edge browser from Microsoft. And I'm going to go to Copilot, and I'm going to type in, can you give me the Catholic parish for San Isidro de Ciénaga del Toro, Nuevo León, Mexico? And Copilot came back and said, I'm sorry, but I couldn't find a specific information on that parish. It's possible that the parish may be under a different name or part of a larger diocese in the region. I recommend reaching out, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so there's some suggestions. It's nice. They've just brushed you off. But on the other hand, we now know the next step. And the next step is to ask, can you give me the Catholic parish for Galeana, Nuevo León, Mexico? Okay, so we learned that the town was in a municipality, which was in a state, which was in the country. And so now we just moved up the next level and asked the same question. And now we have two parishes. We have Parroquia de San Pablo Postal, and then we have San Jose de las Raíces Parroquia. And that's doable. We're going to be able to find the information we're looking for. And we can go then to the records that are on Family Search and see if these parish records have been digitized. If it's Mexico, the chances are very, very good that Family Search has the records that we're looking for. So now we go look in Family Search, and we find this set of records: Mexico, Nuevo Leon Catholic Church records, Mexico. These are other parish registers from 1667 to 1981, which is a lot of records. And so there's a long list in here. And so we can begin to look for Galeana, or we can look for the San Isidro parish. So now we're looking at this set of records. This is a lot of records. So without knowing the exact locations we're interested in, it's a hopeless task. So then we find it, the Archivo de la Parroquia de San Pablo, and it's in Galeana, and that's in Enel, it's Nuevo Leon. And we're there. And now we can be actually looking for the records for the specific ancestor that we're looking for. And we can ultimately, because we now have this much more information, we could contact this church directly. But what you're going to find is that you've run into another thing that you may need to know about the Catholic Church, and that is that an iglesia is not a place where they kept records. You and I would call it cathedral or catedral, where the records are usually kept in the parish level. And since this is part of the parish, but it's sort of like a temporary place of church, it's where the priest comes and visits, but is not stationed. It'd be very unusual to have a priest stationed at an iglesia. This process works in every part of the world for every kind of record that you want to look for. This, just what I just showed you, is the key process I've done thousands and thousands of times over and over and over with people when we try to find the exact place of an event in their ancestors' lives. So let's look for the other one. I'm giving equal time here now to Google Gemini, and I start asking about a place in Arizona. And an interesting way to get started here, and this is something that I encourage people to do, is when you start doing searches and you start trying to find information and you want to know how it works, you want to know how these AI chatbots work, then ask it for information you already know. And then you'll see whether or not it can find what you already know. And this is obviously something I already know. And the reason being is because it was my great-great-grandparents and great-grandparents that settled Nutrioso in Arizona. So we were there. My relatives were there first with all the very first people. Okay, so now it's telling us a little bit about the place, and we want to know where some records would be. But we already know the state and county because it's in Arizona, and it says right here that it's an unincorporated community in Apache County. So now we know where the records are. But we can go to Apache County on the Research Wiki once again, and we have a lot more information about records, what's available, what they have, what's available to courthouse, and you're on your way to actually finding some records. Now, this is what it said. It said that it was important when the Mormon refugees relocated there after nearby settlements were attacked. So a fort was built in 1880 and a post office was established in 83. So when they got there, they weren't a bunch of babies. They were grown people. And so they had either been born or married or whatever in other towns before that, or even other places outside of the area of the state of Arizona. So in this case, the question is, were there any records before 1880? And that's something you would need to investigate. I think the Research Wiki is going to tell the answer to that question and give you some guidance, but it may not get to every state, every place in the world, and so you still have to ask the similar kind of questions. Yes, the answer here is yes, there were records because they came from other nearby settlements. So then what do we do? I was on Gemini, which wouldn't give me anything more about that. So I switched back to Microsoft Copilot and I asked, when were the earliest European settlements in Arizona? And can you give me a timeline of Mormon settlements in Arizona? So now we're getting into the time frames of when all of these various things happened. And from this, you can tell very clearly that if someone got to Arizona before 1846, they're probably not going to be recorded unless they passed through and got recorded because they passed through. So you're getting some time frames and limits here. The only difference is this is going to make when you get out of the like doing this focus on the records in the United States and in some place like Mexico that's very predictable as far as where the records are going to be, is that you're going to have a little more complication because there's going to be boundary changes and there's going to be wars and there's going to be all sorts of things that are going to determine whether or not a particular group of records is in one place or another. But this gives me some earliest dates for records. And that means that I'm not going to be looking for any kind of records back before around 1850 or 1846. Now let's kind of just jump because I've given two examples here, one from Mexico and one from the United States, but I'm going to get into some ideas here about what happens when we get into European jurisdictions. So what's the problem here? Poland is probably the poster country, the major country for genealogists who understand some of the history, because Poland is a place that basically disappears and reappears and disappears and then reappears over historical times. And so when somebody says that they were born in Poland, you have to start focusing on the history of Poland and the boundary changes for Poland and who claimed Poland at that time and who might have had the records and were the records possibly going to be in Polish? And the answer is maybe, but they probably are going to be in German or Russian or both. Okay, so this is it's just a matter of digging down into the history, and then you'll begin to understand the different boundary changes and land controlled changes that occurred primarily there in the central part of Europe. So if you don't know some of these dates when it occurred back and forth, then you basically are going to come up with kind of contradictory information. So if your ancestor came from what we would traditionally call Poland, and it happened during the time of the partitions of Poland between Prussia, Russia, and Austria, then they may say they came from Germany, which didn't exist, but is the shorthand term for saying that you came from a country in Central Europe that spoke German, even though it could have been Poland. And it's interesting for me that I frequently see that as I go look for records in Central Europe, I'll find that the records are in German, even if the country itself doesn't read German or doesn't speak German. Now, there's another major factor, and it becomes even more important when you go over into any place over in Europe with a long history of boundary changes and conquests and wars. And so when you're looking at the map, you need to have a date for each time that map occurs. And you may find that your ancestor was not born in Austria, but they were born in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and that they spoke Hungarian. So this is sometimes you have to just keep going and doing the research to discover that. And you can see here the complexity of trying to keep track of names, and especially when these names change with the advent of whoever conquered the land. So these names in this particular area of the world, particularly a little bit further north up there in Poland, are going to have changed from Polish to German or to Russian and back to Polish or not. And the place names are all going to be renamed every time somebody came in. So there's going to be a tremendous amount of research that needs to be done initially so that you understand the historical background as well as the changes in the boundaries. And then if you are lucky enough to come across some documents that localize your family, you'll have a fairly substantial chance of finding some records because you'll be able to tell where the records would have been during the time that your ancestors were there. But once again, we have to emphasize that jurisdictions, place names, and record locations change over time. And so as we are following this, we need to keep like a scoreboard that shows where all of these different time places change that give us an indication that the records may have moved. They may not. They may be in the same place. They may not be in the same place. Okay, so once you identify that place where your ancestors or relatives lived, then you can start asking questions about the jurisdictions and get a timeline for where the records might be located. So here's maps of the territorial evolution of Poland from year 1000 to post-World War II. And so you're going to be able to see when and where and how the records may or may not have existed in that time frame. And here's a timeline and explanation from, once again, from Microsoft Copilot, telling me about the changes in the boundaries and partitions and actions that happened in Poland up to and including World War II. And you can substitute any other country, any other information that you're trying to find. It's not a formula. There's no cut dried way of doing the searches on a chatbot. But you can usually this gives you information. In the case of Microsoft, it gives you the specific references to where they got the information off the internet. So now we do have tools for quickly finding the jurisdictions and finding records around the world online. And you can ask the chatbot where the records are, and they may or may not know. The thing about these chatbots is they're not infallible. They're not superhuman. They're just simply a very advanced search engine. So you can get pretty much any information you want. After that, the next step, go find the records and then translate them or transcribe them or get it transcribed or whatever you need to do to find the information that you're looking for. If you know the place and the time, you can start looking. Thanks for watching. Okay, anybody have some long involved questions they want to ask?
Get plugged for AI.
Well, yeah, and as you understand that right now I see a direct relationship between how much faster I can produce things with AI if I'm not spending all my time searching through links and to websites. If I'm just getting answers with footnotes that tell me where everything came from.